Yo! Oh my God! Are you guys okay?
Authorities say they found 16 children living in what they called deplorable conditions inside a Hamden home. Two family members, Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders, were also indicted on charges of sexual battery and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. We have been following this case since June 30th, when law enforcement removed those 16 children from that home on Omer Street.
But tonight we learn that child endangerment investigation is actually the third of three separate investigations. 10 TV's Libby Cathy is joining us in studio tonight to walk us through the new details. Libby?
That's right, Yolanda. Jeff, we learned today what initially led authorities to the Siders' home where they discovered those 16 children. It was a separate child sexual abuse investigation, one initially involving two children and two South Bloomingville men, according to authorities. That's 23-year-old Josh Saunders, you see him on your screen, charged with rape and gross sexual imposition, and 40-year-old Brandon Henderson Sr., indicted on 21 charges, including endangering children and sexual battery. These men were arrested today. And that investigation led authorities to Elizabeth and Gary Siders Jr., and separate allegations that the couple sexually abused a minor in 2022. We're told that minor was not a member of their immediate family. Authorities were acting on that sexual abuse investigation on June 30th, there to collect Gary Siders Jr.'s DNA when they discovered the 16 children, sparking the child endangering investigation.
These cases began as an investigation into family child sex abuse. Law enforcement sought the DNA of Gary Siders Jr. related to the child sex abuse case. Once Siders Jr. was located, search warrants were executed to secure his DNA for genetic testing. Upon serving the search warrants for the child sex abuse case, the existence and condition of the 16 children at the Omer Street house became known.
So now all four Siders adults have been indicted on child endangering charges, and Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders are also facing those additional sex crime charges for abuse of a minor that, again, was not one of their children. So we reached out to the Siders defense attorneys about this, and attorney for Gary Siders Sr. sent us a statement saying, in part, they are still in the beginning stages of this case, and discovery has not been received by the defense. He went on to say that defendants are presumed innocent unless proven guilty. Now, I went down to South Bloomingville today. No one I spoke to recognized Saunders or Henderson, but we are keeping in touch with residents there and staying on this story.
12 feet by 12 feet. That's the space investigators say 16 children were confined to for years inside a home in rural Ohio. When officers finally opened that door, the state's own attorney general would later say the children looked almost feral. But here's what nobody expected. The search warrant that led them there had nothing to do with those 16 children at all. It started somewhere else entirely, with an investigation into two other kids, one that would take police somewhere they never anticipated. And by the time this story ends, the woman at the center of it all won't just be a suspect. Some will call her a victim too, one who was never given a choice of her own. So who is she? What happened inside that house? And how did investigators stumble onto one of the most disturbing child welfare cases in Ohio history? Stay with me because this one unravels layer by layer. Welcome back to Real Crime Stories. If true crime cases like this keep you up at night wanting answers, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes. And drop a comment if you've been following the Siders case too. This case involves children, so I'll be walking through it carefully and respectfully. Let's get into it. Let's rewind the clock to December 2025, months before any of this made national headlines. At that point, nobody in Vinton County had any idea what was coming. The Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Special Victims Unit had opened a quiet case, the kind that rarely makes the news, centered on allegations involving two young kids. No cameras, no press conferences. Just a small team of detectives following a thread that seemed, at first, contained. But threads like this rarely stay contained. As agents dug deeper into those initial claims, something in the evidence pointed them toward a second family, a married couple, names that hadn't come up before. By March 2026, that quiet December case had split into something new, a separate probe this time targeting a man named Gary Siders Jr. and his wife, Elizabeth. The allegation was specific and disturbing. That years earlier, between January and September of 2022, the couple had engaged in sexual conduct with a minor more than a decade younger than themselves. Crucially, officials stressed this victim wasn't part of their own household, a stranger to their family tree, yet somehow connected to the web investigators were untangling. Here's where I want you to pause with me for a second, because most true crime stories build toward one shocking reveal. This one builds toward two, and the second is so much bigger than anyone in that department could have predicted. To pursue the March case, detectives needed something concrete, biological evidence tying Gary Jr. to the alleged 2022 conduct, so they sought a warrant, not for a search of a property, not yet, just DNA, a simple procedural step in what looked like a straightforward abuse investigation, except procedural steps have a way of cracking doors wide open. Because getting that DNA meant agents needed access to Gary Jr., and accessing Gary Jr. meant going to where he lived, a modest house on Omer Street in the small town of Hamden, a town most Americans couldn't point to on a map before this June. Population barely 1,000. What officers encountered when they arrived would change the entire scope of this case. I won't get ahead of myself. That discovery deserves its own chapter, and I promise we'll get there. But understand this. The sexual abuse allegations from December, the ones nobody outside a small circle of investigators even knew about, were the reason anyone ever set foot inside that home at all. Without that original case, without those two children who came forward months earlier, the horror waiting behind that door might never have surfaced. Quick request before we continue: if you're finding this case as unsettling as I am, tap that subscribe button now. There's more ahead, and I don't want you missing the next chapter. By the time spring turned to summer, investigators weren't just chasing one allegation anymore. They were sitting on a warrant, a suspect list growing by the week, and a gut feeling that something inside that Hamden property went far beyond what the DNA request alone could explain. Elizabeth herself remains, even now, a complicated figure in this story. Married at 15, with her own parents' signature giving legal permission. A teenager becoming a wife to a man 3 years her senior. Attorneys and advocates have since raised uncomfortable questions about whether she was ever truly free to choose any part of the life that followed. Questions we'll sit with more fully as this story continues. For now, picture this. A rural county sheriff's department, a routine-sounding DNA warrant in hand, and officers walking up to a quiet front porch with absolutely no idea that behind it sat one of the most disturbing child welfare discoveries their state had seen in years. What they found next didn't just confirm a crime. It exposed 16 lives that had been hidden from the world. The door opened, and what greeted officers wasn't what any of them had trained for. 16 children, ranging from 18 months old to 18 years, nearly 2 decades of siblings, cousins, sons, and daughters, all under one roof, all unaccounted for by the outside world. No school records, no pediatrician visits on file, no paper trail marking their existence beyond birth certificates tucked away somewhere in that house. According to accounts later shared by law enforcement, many of these kids had spent years confined to a single room, roughly 12 feet across in each direction. Think about that dimension for a moment. A space smaller than most bedrooms, holding a fraction of a family meant to grow, play, and roam freely. Ohio's Attorney General didn't mince words describing what his team witnessed. He said the youngsters appeared almost feral, a term rarely used in official statements, chosen deliberately because softer language couldn't capture the reality. Investigators went further, comparing the living conditions to something worse than how livestock gets treated on a typical farm. Let that settle for a second, because I think it's easy to hear numbers and forget these are actual kids we're talking about, real names, real fears, real nights spent wondering why their world looked nothing like anyone else's. Medical teams took custody of all 16 once removal began. Hospitals became the first safe space many had ever known outside those four walls. Doctors and social workers started the slow process of assessing malnutrition, developmental delays, and trauma that likely ran deeper than any physical exam could measure. Meanwhile, 4 adults connected to the household faced arrest almost immediately. Gary Siders Jr., his wife Elizabeth, his father Gary Siders Sr., and stepmother Christina. Each would eventually stand accused of endangering every single child pulled from that property, though prosecutors structured the counts differently depending on each defendant's alleged role. Here's something that complicates this narrative even further, and it's a detail I promised we'd circle back to. Investigators used the phrase intrafamily when describing this case, language suggesting the children's parentage might extend beyond a single married couple. Elizabeth's own defense attorney has publicly stated all 16 are biologically hers. Unverified claims circulating since have suggested she may have begun having children as young as 13, though officials have only confirmed the 16 actually removed from the property. I want to be careful here, because speculation spreads fast in cases like this, and not everything reported gets confirmed by authorities. What we do know, the oldest child discovered was 18, born just 2 months after Elizabeth and Gary's wedding in 2008, a ceremony that took place in neighboring West Virginia when she was only 15. 15 years old, walking down an aisle with parental consent, into a marriage that would eventually produce, by some accounts, 20 pregnancies before she turned 33. Advocates who have studied cases like hers describe a pattern that goes beyond simple culpability. One attorney, unaffiliated with the case, called it emblematic of systems failing girls long before anyone intervenes, suggesting Elizabeth herself may have been shaped by forced motherhood before she ever had agency over her own adulthood. That doesn't erase what happened to 16 children behind closed doors, but it does add a layer this story can't ignore. Remember that DNA warrant one investigators originally sought as part of a quieter, separate probe. That thread never went away. While the world was still absorbing news of 16 children pulled from a Hamden property, prosecutors were finishing work on an entirely different case, one that predates the discovery by months and involves someone outside the immediate household altogether. On August 21st, a grand jury handed down fresh indictments. Gary Jr. and Elizabeth now faced 4 additional charges apiece: 2 counts of sexual battery, 2 counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. The alleged victim, according to Attorney General Andy Wilson's office, is not a relative, someone more than 10 years younger than the couple, targeted between January and September of 2022 combined with the original endangerment counts. Both Gary Jr. and Elizabeth now stand accused of 19 separate offenses connected to conditions inside their home, plus these 4 newer charges tied to a completely different alleged crime. 23 counts total, each carrying its own weight, its own hearing, its own potential consequence. They weren't alone in that August announcement either. 2 men described as known associates of the family, Joshua Saunders, 23, and Brandon Henderson Sr., 40, were arrested the same day. Saunders faces 4 charges including rape. Henderson faces 21, spanning endangerment, sexual imposition, and battery. Officials haven't clarified exactly how these men connect to the Siders household, only that a relationship exists. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many separate threads does it take before a pattern becomes impossible to ignore? 2 additional men, 2 more sets of felony charges, and a family already facing dozens of counts. This isn't isolated anymore. It's systemic. Bond amounts tell their own story too. Elizabeth, Christina, and Gary Jr. remain held on $300,000 each. Gary Sr. meanwhile, secured release under similar conditions after requiring hospitalization, a detail that sparked its own debate among viewers following this case closely. All 4 family members have entered not guilty pleas on the original endangerment charges, but defense attorneys aren't stopping there. Competency evaluations are now underway for every defendant, questioning whether any of them are mentally fit to stand trial at all. Elizabeth's attorney, Thomas Stoley, pushed further still, requesting a second evaluation specifically to explore an insanity defense should she be deemed competent. Think about what that means for a moment. A woman married at 15, allegedly raising, by some unconfirmed accounts, as many as 20 children starting from her own childhood, now facing arguments in court about whether trauma or diminished capacity shaped decades of her adult life. Whatever verdict eventually comes, this case is forcing uncomfortable conversations about where victimhood ends and culpability begins. Investigators, for their part, have been careful about one thing: ruling out human trafficking as a motive. Whatever drove conditions inside that Ulmer Street property, officials say it doesn't fit that particular framework, which somehow makes this stranger, not simpler, a family structure built entirely inward, isolated from oversight, church records, school enrollment, or any outside intervention for potentially 2 decades. 16 children are now receiving medical care, evaluation, and hopefully, the beginning of lives outside that 12 by 12 room. 4 adults face courtrooms in the months ahead. 2 more men sit charged in a related investigation. And an attorney general's office says, plainly, this remains ongoing, more could still surface. So here's where I leave you tonight. A case that began with a quiet December tip about 2 unrelated children ended up exposing one of the most disturbing family structures Ohio has documented in years, and it's still not finished unfolding. If this story affected you the way it affected me researching it, let me know in the comments which chapter hit hardest. And if you want to be here the moment new developments break on this case, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss it. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.